Welcome, everyone. I am Liz Dozier, the founder and CEO of Chicago Beyond. I'll also be your moderator today. I am a former Chicago Public Schools teacher, as well as a high school principal. I founded Chicago Beyond in 2016 to back the fight for equity here in our city and beyond, and specifically the fight for equity for Black and Brown young people. I'm grateful you're here today for this short hour to engage in this conversation, the conversation of unpacking white privilege, how to be an ally, and how to be an anti-racist. As your moderator, I have three things that I want you to notice today. One, I want to talk about being uncomfortable. And oftentimes in our bodies, we get uncomfortable and then distract ourselves, check that email, pick up our phone, walk away from our computers. And I just want to hold space for that and to let you know when you, and if you feel that, just to notice that and to stick with it and not to tune out. Two, you'll notice that there are no Black people on our panel today. I'm a Black woman. I am moderating the panel today, but not on it. We believe that it was important right now to have white people talking directly to other white people about their own journeys as it relates to understanding white privilege, again, what it means to be an ally and what it means to be an anti-racist. The third thing I'd like you to notice today is that no one, including myself, is here without our own flaws, and no one is here that hasn't been on a journey. We're all on a journey as you all are too. And so just to notice and be cognizant of those three things. A few housekeeping notes. We are really excited to dig into questions that you have. And so if you have questions, you'll notice at the bottom of the screen a little Q&A box. Click that. We will get your questions. I have them right here. I'll pull them up on my iPad. So please submit your questions on the bottom of the screen. Thank you to those who submitted them ahead of time. I already have a few that I pulled that we'll be asking during the Q&A section. Quick shout out to Now This News, who is broadcasting us live and broadcasting this conversation on Facebook. There are thousands of you, which is kind of hard to believe, but there are thousands of you that are watching and listening from across not just the US, but in other countries across the world. And we're glad you're here. We have educational superintendents in California, bankers in New York, moms and dads, philanthropists, like there's just a ton of people who are here. The UK, Canada is represented, a lot of folks here. So thank you for being here with us today. We want you to know that after this conversation, we are going to send you out a toolkit, and the toolkit will be full of resources to continue on with your own individual journey. I do want to give a quick warning, and I've talked to the panelists about this ahead of time, but as some of you know who are in this work, in this moment, there have been white supremacists who have been hacking into screens, and especially when it comes to conversations that have to do with race or Blackness or the like. And we know that if something like that happens, you'll begin to notice things on the screen that shouldn't be there, everything from pornography to racial slurs. If that does happen, I just want you to know that we'll be aware of it. We will pause the program. We'll make sure that gets handled, and we will move forward with this important conversation. So with that, I'll just give you a quick rundown on who we've got with us today. We've got Arnie Duncan, who's a former Chicago Public Schools CEO. He was also the education secretary under Barack Obama, and he now runs the organization Chicago Cred. Christian Picciolini is he's an author, he's an advocate for peace. He's also a former leader in the neo-Nazi movement, and he now has devoted his life to ending extremism and does work all over the world. He also has a new book. If you haven't checked it out, I started reading it this weekend, Breaking Hate. You should check that out. We're not going to spend too much time on their bios and digging into all the things that you might suspect. I want you to know that we're short on time, as you might suspect, and so you can read all about them on their websites and YouTubes and all of that. But I want to really spend time today focused on each of their journeys as white men in this world, in our country. And so that's where we're going to spend the bulk of our time with them on unpacking white privilege, again, what it means to be an ally and an anti-racist. Today is really about learning. And honestly, it's about unlearning some things too. And so I thank them for being here with us today. So welcome, guys. People wrote into us, and the majority of the people that wrote in, or a good chunk, I should say, really wanted us to start from the very beginning of like, what is racism? What is white privilege? And let's ground there. And so I want to read you a quick quote. And I don't know if many of you have seen this, but there was a great Kareem Abdul-Jabbar piece in the Los Angeles Times. I think it was like last week around there. And there is a piece in there where he talks about racism in America. And I'll just read it to you. He says, racism in America is like dust in the air. It seems invisible even when you're choking on it, until you let the sun in. Then you see it's everywhere. We need to keep shining light so we have a chance to clean it wherever it lands. We have to stay vigilant. So with that, I want to throw up on our screen, if the Chicago Beyond folks could help me here, I want to throw up the definition of white privilege on the screen and then ask a question to our panelists. The definition of white privilege, as we're going to define it today, is about having greater access to power and resources than people of color in the same situation. And so how that connects, white privilege upholds the racism that was described in that quote. And so, Christian, I'm going to turn to you first. And what I'd like to do is really have you help us make sense of the definition that we're seeing on the screen. And then I want you to just walk through when you first realized that there were areas of your life or positive experiences that you've had, and they were singularly contributed to the fact that you were white and that you had white privilege.
Sure. Thanks, Liz. And it's a real pleasure to be here with you and with Arnie. I kind of want to start out first by acknowledging my privilege, the fact that I am here, a former white supremacist from 25 years ago, who's been given a second chance, where oftentimes people of color are not given that second chance like I've been given. So I wanted to acknowledge that. And I want to talk a little bit about my own story and how I got there and found that privilege. I was recruited into the neo-Nazi skinhead movement when I was 14 years old in 1987. I spent 8 years as part of that and became a leader within that movement. Got out in 1996 and right away acknowledged saw my privilege in action. The fact that for 8 years I was a racist, a violent racist, somebody who developed propaganda, somebody who hurt other people with my words and with my fists, somebody who created a very unsafe environment, not just for people of color, but for everybody in my near vicinity, and was able to very quickly overcome that once I denounced the movement without doing a whole lot of work to repair the damage that I had caused. I've since then done the work to try and repair that damage. It's been 25 years, but I can tell you right off the bat, having been that quote unquote bad guy, I wasn't seen as a threat by police. I wasn't seen as a threat by people in my community. Nobody called me out on what I was doing. Nobody oppressed me because of the damage that I was causing. And that to me was the privilege, that I was a white man who was, for all intent and purpose, a criminal, a violent person, who was not being held to account and was being given a pass. And found, although my finding redemption for those 25 years wasn't easy, I do feel that it was easier for me as a white man to kind of go through and find that redemption than it would be for somebody of color. So I think for me, understanding that it wasn't, although it was a hard road, wasn't as hard as it is for other people who might have, darker skin, was the first sign for me.
Let me ask you this, because this question came through a few times, both with like pre-questions and is popping up now, but like people have questions like, so, around, like, I grew up poor, I'm a white and I'm poor. And therefore, like, I don't have the privilege of wealth. I don't have some, leg ahead. Like, how is it possible that I have white privilege? So I just want you to dig a little bit more into like what white privilege is and like answer that question.
Yeah, sure. White privilege doesn't mean that white people don't struggle, that there aren't challenges to living. However, what white people don't have is the struggle of their skin color to contend with every day as they're making it through life. So that is a privilege. The fact that people of color, we can go back 500 years from slavery to Jim Crow to segregation to, things like the housing market not being available to people and accumulation of wealth. Although white people have faced some of those things, it's never been because of their skin color. It's never been because they've been white that they've struggled. And that's something that is, inherent to people of color that they carry around with them every day. So the fact that I, as a white man, may struggle with being poor, may struggle to find work, that's not what we're talking about when we talk about white privilege. The white privilege we're talking about is the fact that we don't die because of our skin color, that we aren't treated differently because of what we look like, that we aren't having things taken away from us because of people's stereotype of who we are.
Arnie, I'll throw the same question to you too. When did you first realize your white privilege?
It's a great question. I don't have an easy answer, and I guess we're all products of our environment, and my environment was a little different. I grew up, it's fascinating to hear Christian's story. I grew up in middle-class integrated Hyde Park, and was born in 1964, but in 1961, my mother started an inner-city tutoring program on 46th Street, and she raised my brother and sister and I literally from the time we were babies, so we grew up in that environment. And people talk about different zip codes or whatever. This was 12 blocks from our house. We literally walked there some days, but it was across the invisible barrier of 47th Street between middle-class integrated Hyde Park and all black, all poor North Kenwood, Oakland. And so that's just where we grew up. That was my first friends. Those are still my best friends. That's where I learned to play basketball. That's where I got my passion for education, trying to fight this inequity. But there are two things I remember. It's sort of this combination of race and class. What I knew was that every single day that my sister and brother and I could come home, and while we spent every afternoon with our friends, we would come home to our house that was, again, literally 12 blocks away. We lived on 56th Street. My mother's program was on 46th Street. We would come back to a neighborhood that was safe. We had a roof over our heads. We had food. And our friends during the afternoon didn't have those things. And some of these things are sort of funny, but they're not. I can't even tell you how many times growing up, 20, 30 times, innumerable times, my mother would be stopped by the police. And it was always because there was a white woman driving in a black neighborhood. And every single interaction was positive. And every single time they would come over and say, can we help you? Or are you lost? And my mother would get, it was always just sort of funny at the time. I would sort of pin him and say, you must be a rookie or you must be new around here. And I've been coming down this neighborhood for 10 or 15 or 20 or 30 years, whatever it was at that point. And I'm not lost at all. I know exactly what I'm doing. But never once was I scared in those situations, ever. And I contrasted that to what my friends' experiences were with the police. And obviously, given George Floyd recently, given Laquan McDonald, given so much of what's happening around the country, I never had that fear. And I knew what my friends' experiences were radically, radically different. So I can't say there was a moment. It was just sort of a coming of age thing and seeing just the tremendous inequalities and seeing the benefits that I had. Everyone in my mother's program was poor. Everyone was black. Growing up in middle class, integrated Hyde Park, I'd never met a poor white person. There are lots of poor white people. I've traveled to Appalachia, I've done other things, and Christian talked about challenges, they cut across races. But the fundamental inequality in health, in safety, and access to educational opportunity I literally live those two worlds every day. And that's where, you know, sort of my passion for trying to work on these inequities, that's what it comes from, because I've seen it all my life.
Liz, we can't hear you. There you go.
All right, there we go. Sorry about that. Zoom technical difficulties. Sorry. We're gonna unpack structural racism shortly, but before we get there, I think there are, you know, in hearing what both of you are saying, there are messages that are delivered, and some are very overt and some are not, about just racial messaging about what is true and who, you know, who's on top, who's on the bottom. And I really want to have you each recall some of the earliest racial messages that you remember in particular. And I want to try to move beyond like what you were told, but what you, if maybe you could share with us some of the implicit messages that you saw in your general environment. I'll just toss this out to whoever wants to go first.
Well, I remember being a kid and growing up, and even before I was exposed to, you know, what I would, you know, adopt as racism. You know, looking back now, I remember even sayings when we were kids, like when you would jump on a group of friends when you were playing around. I'm talking about little kids, you know, 6, 7, 8 years old. It would be called the N-word pile. I mean, even the racism that we didn't even know we were spreading at the time, but was certainly given to us from, you know, generations before us, and we adopted, that we carried that without even knowing, you know, outside of our group, that it was going to hurt anybody, and then absorbing that in our lives and carrying this racism that we would expose other people to without even, you know, in certain cases knowing that we were doing it as kids. But I, you know, I really think that the first time that I saw race as a thing for me personally was from my parents, actually, you know, because my parents are Italian immigrants, and when they first came to the U.S., even as, you know, Europeans or Italians were treated with prejudice. So I think, you know, as far as racism or prejudice, that was my first exposure to that. And even though I was always surrounded by people from other parts of the world, different religions and backgrounds, eventually at one point I was able to forget all of that and kind of put racism on as a suit of armor, thinking I was using it to protect myself.
Yeah, I'll just jump in here. You know, I'm not on the panel, I'm just the moderator, but I got my 2 cents to add there too. I just remember as a girl, as a Black girl growing up, never seen people that looked like me on TV or in magazine unless I had an Ebony or a Jet, or, you know, going, you know, seeing movies, and all those movies, like if there were Black people in them, they weren't ever like the hero or they were the, you know, second fiddle to somebody, or like there was some white person helping this Black person out. And I think all those implicit messages, it is the ones we see like that are very like, you know, the name calling or the thing, but it's also like the very, almost like what Kareem Abdul-Jabbar described as like the dust in the air. Like it is everywhere. And once you really begin to do your own individual work and see it, you can't really unsee it. I don't know, Arne, if you want to add anything there.
Yeah, I think it's so important, again, that we be really vulnerable in these conversations and talk about where we're succeeded and where we're failed and what we've learned. And I do think this idea of whether it's dust or this invisible but omnipresent sense is so important. And as horrific as a video like the George Floyd murder is, as horrific as Laquan McDonald's, you know, murder here in Chicago a few years back, those are galvanizing moments. But this structural systemic thing we're talking about cannot be seen by an iPhone. It can't be captured. Mm-hmm. And while these moments hopefully galvanize us, the moments are not the entire problem. They are simply symbolic of this larger thing. So let me just, you know, you and I both come from CPS. Let me just tell you 2 quick stories of what we did historically, that we were part of this racism, or the system was part of this racism. So when I first became the CEO, I went to the head of the police department, the new police chief. He was, you know, new on the job as well. and said, you guys are arresting too many, young kids. I hate the school, the young people in prison pipeline. What can you do about it? He said, okay, let me look at the data. The police shifts are 12 at night to 8 in the morning, 8 in the morning to 4 in the afternoon, then 4 in the morning till 12 at night, 3 shifts. He came back 2 or 3 weeks later, and the vast majority of the arrests of young people were between 8 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon. It wasn't in the afternoon, late in the afternoon, it wasn't at night. Who was arresting? How were those young people being arrested? Our schools. Our schools were calling the police to arrest our young people. And it was a devastating punch in the gut. And I was so happy that, I was ready to blame the police and tell them to have reform, but we had to go back and fundamentally think about how we retrained our principals to handle discipline issues, and how, it was amazing to see certain schools where the police never got called, and other schools literally 4 or 5 blocks away, same South and West Sides, you and I know so well, where 100 times a year, basically every other day, the police were called to arrest young people. That's something that's systemic, endemic to the system, done without thinking. And in a district that is 90% minority, those are young people of color being arrested. Those are people, Liz, who look like you, not like me and Chris. The second one is we worked really hard over a couple years to increase the number of young people taking and passing AP classes. And after 4 years, we doubled that number. And we were thrilled about that and celebrated that. I remember doing it down at the start of a school year at Symphony Hall with all the principals, administrators. You may have been there, I'm not even sure. But what I said after celebration, I just sort of stopped and said, does anyone honestly think that our students today, 4 years later, are twice as smart as they were 4 years ago? And we all hope they were a little bit smarter and a little bit more prepared because of other things we had done. But the room got real quiet. And what it meant, again, the only way we doubled those numbers, it wasn't because more white kids were taking it. We didn't have enough white kids in the system. This was more students of color who were taking and passing AP classes. And the hard truth, the brutal truth, is that we had systemically as a system denied them those opportunities historically. We finally opened the door and they passed. And the only explanation I have as to why we denied those opportunities is that these were kids of color, and that somehow we, white and black, this is often about class, not just about race, we systemically, as a public school system, for all our good intentions, denied those brilliant kids of color the chance to take AP classes.
Yeah, and that's where I'm happy you share that. And I want to double click on what you said about intentions, because I think that's a really important point. And it goes to this idea of, and I don't know if, so for our audience, I'll just show this book. If you have not seen it, you should definitely get it. But How to Be an Anti-Racist for Ibram Kendi. And he talks in this book about the difference between saying, I'm not a racist, and being anti-racist. And I'm gonna read this a little, I wanna read a piece of this, and I have a question for you guys. If Chicago Beyond, if you could cue that slide really quick while I read this. So he says, what's the problem with being not racist? As a claim that signifies neutrality. I am not a racist, but neither am I aggressively against racism. But there is no neutrality in the racism struggle. The opposite of racist isn't not racist, it is anti-racist. One either believes problems are rooted in groups of people as a racist, or locates the roots of problems in power and policies as an anti-racist. One either allows racial inequities to persevere as a racist, or confronts racial inequities as an anti-racist. There is no in-between safe space of not racist. The claim of not racist, neutrality, is a mask for racism. This may seem harsh, but it's important at the outset that we apply one of the core principles of anti-racism, which is to return the word racist itself to its proper usage. Racist is not the worst word. It is not the equivalent of a slur. It is descriptive. And the only way to undo racism is to consistently identify and describe it, and then dismantle it. The attempt to turn this usefully descriptive term into an almost unusable slur is, of course, designed to do the opposite, to freeze us into inaction. And so I want to cue up, Chicago Bound people, if you can hear me, I want to cue up the sign that we've been seeing a lot at protests. I'm not sure if I'm sure folks here on the call, and perhaps the two of you have been out to marches and protests of recent. And there's this sign that I've seen, and Chicago Beyond, I'll put it up on the screen in a second, but it has to do with white silence. And I'd like to talk about, as we think about intention, and as we understand what it is to be anti-racist, if we could talk through the danger of what, well, first talk me through what white silence is, and then why is it dangerous as we try to show up, or as white people try to show up as anti-racist? So whoever would like to start.
Yeah, I'll just say, this is Christian, I'll just say that, first of all, we're in this process, we are all going to screw up as we are learning. And as long as we stumble and we pick ourselves up to keep learning, we'll be okay. Nobody's going to be perfect in this process. Nobody understands exactly what's happening, and we all have to learn and keep moving forward. So I'll just say that first. Second of all, I mean, in the 1920s, there were no Nazis, right? In the 1930s, there were some, and then eventually a majority elected Hitler into office. And eventually the whole country, most of the country was supportive of that. At one point during that process, people decided to be silent to what they were seeing happening and to let that exist. To be not racist is to be silent. Even if you don't think you have racist intentions, if you don't see yourself as being a racist, being not racist is not good enough, because it is being silent to what is happening. And if you're silent, you are complying with what is happening. Being an anti-racist is uncomfortable, but it's necessary to fight in this process, because being an ally means stepping out of your comfort zone and empowering people that for generations have not had it and are relying to some degree on some level of allyship to open that power structure up. Racism is really all about control of power. If you look at it that way, if you look at racism as who controls the power and opening that up, we all have a part to play in that. We all have, even if we can't hire people of color to fill, roles of leadership, even if we don't think we have the power to change the world or even to change the community we live in, we all have the power to talk to somebody, to the people closest to us, to affect them. And it's our responsibility to be that anti-racist, to stand up when we see racism, to call it out. And it doesn't have to always be aggressive, but it does mean stepping out of that comfort zone to call it out when you see it.
Yeah.
I'll just add, Liz, that your quote, I won't get it perfectly, but it basically reminds me of King's quote that the biggest threat sort of isn't the white extremist, it's the white moderate. And it's the silence of the moderate that is the most damaging and the most devastating. And as we talk about the systemic oppression and the systemic inequities, it is every system. It is education, it is healthcare, it is housing, it is a criminal justice system. It's why crack was a criminal issue and why opioid addiction is a healthcare issue. Every part of our society, unfortunately, is shaped by race. And in every bucket, healthcare, education, criminal justice reform, whatever it might be, policing, those that have the least, those that are the most oppressed are those of color. And so I think it's incumbent upon all of us. It's always interesting how, in a company or wherever, when you're talking about diversity and inclusion, everybody sort of looks to the black guy in the room, the black woman in the room, and say, "You fix it. You straighten out our culture." And I think that's unfair, and I think it's exhausting, and that none of us can do this alone, and that all of us have to try our best. I think I'll speak for myself. I think we're all feeling inadequate now. I think we're all feeling and knowing we have not done enough. That in 2020 we are so far from where we need to be. That fights in the 60s, the civil rights generation, fights that we thought we won, whether it's around police, whether it's around voter suppression, we haven't won those fights. Those fights are still active. So you either you either quit, you walk away, you say, Liz, you and folks of color, you figure it out, we screwed it up, or we all just try a little harder, a little smarter, and try and be a little bit more collaborative. And to both your points, I think we have to make ourselves increasingly uncomfortable. I mean, I think about Brian Stevenson all the time. His things that I, try and live very imperfectly is to be proximate, to be out there in the streets, to be in places where maybe from a physical safety standpoint, you don't feel you're safest, but it's important to know and talk to the young men and hear them on the violence issues we're working on now. Move outside our comfort zones. And so now more than ever, again, we're at a fork in the road, and there's no guarantee. Well, this is a moment. The question is whether anything comes of this moment. And progress for me is not inevitable. I'm always optimistic by trying to be realistic. Neither we will collectively, not overnight, but over the next 5 years, 10 years, fundamentally change some of these inequities and make things fairer and reduce racism and reduce privilege based upon race, or it could get worse. It could be exacerbated. And I'll just always speak from the heart, given the leadership in DC and from Trump, it's terrifying. That's very possible. And so I just feel, is more than ever before that all of us, it doesn't matter who you are, all of us have to do more, work harder, get outside our comfort zones, be proximate, and try and figure out, can we take these horrific tragedies like the George Floyd murder and not just remember that bad time, but say something good came of that. And again, there's no guarantee that happens. That's just honestly up to all of us in little ways and big ways and hyper local and at the national level. Can we do the things necessary to fundamentally challenge that status quo that did not, this does not start 2 weeks ago with George Floyd's murder. This started 400 years ago and it hasn't stopped.
Right, which is interesting because I totally hear what you're saying. I think for a lot of people, like they did start, but they are now just becoming aware, like really aware of what you described, like the oppression. I think it is all of our responsibility to take that anti-racist journey that we're describing, and that is around action. Like it's not just knowing, but it is not just showing up at the protest, but what is the actual action that we're putting behind it to disrupt that system.
And I would just say, Liz, no more statements. We've had so many statements.
Yeah.
They're all good. They're all important. But I don't need to read another statement.
Yeah.
We gotta act.
I'm so with you. I'm sure all of us have been inundated with the statements from the large corporations. Now, I don't even read any more deletes. Like, what is the action steps that we are taking? And I'll meet you on that road. Let's still talk a little bit about, and Arnie, you alluded to this, the idea of structural racism and that versus like the event. And a lot of people are coming out in this moment and we're lifting George Floyd's name up. And we also need to be cognizant of the racialized and oppressive nature, essentially racism that allowed that to even happen, not just to George Floyd, but to, dozens and dozens and hundreds of men under the police department. But also, I think about just like Black bodies being obliterated in the history of our country. That allowed that to happen was racism. So I really want either of you or both of you just unpack, what does it mean to say that racism is a structure and it is not an event? And before you answer that, Chicago Beyond, if you guys could throw up that screen really quick. We're talking about institutional racism here. So that's policies and practices within institutions, and institutions can be government, society, it's all that. But policies and practices within institutions that benefit white people to the disadvantages of people of color. And so Chicago Beyond folks, you can take that down. And I'll throw the question back out to you, Christian and Arnie. What does it mean to say racism is a structure and it's not an event?
Well, I think Arnie got it right exactly when he said it is not about these individual events like the murder of George Floyd or Laquan McDonald or any of these very high profile racist events that we're seeing. Yes, those events are happening all the time. But I think what we're talking about when we talk about systemic or institutional racism is that from the very beginning, our institutions of housing and finance and education and criminal justice have been designed essentially to be of disadvantage to people of color. They've been set up by white societies to maintain power over the minorities within their community from the very beginning. So when we look at slavery and we kind of juxtapose it over, the criminal justice system today and the prison industrial complex, where we have, millions of people in prison, the majority of them people of color, it was a way essentially for white power structure to enslave, imprison people of color for laws that they created along the way in order to maintain that power. So I think Arnie had it exactly right. We can't focus on these individual instances. They happen all the time, and they will continue to happen unless we change the institutions and systems that are factories for this racism to exist.
So what do people do? So this is, I want to ask this last couple of questions, and I want to open it up. We've got thousands of people here. We've got literally hundreds of questions rolling in. And so I want to open it up, but want to just push us to action. So talk about the role of what it means to be a white ally. What does it mean, not just in this moment, but what does it mean to be a white ally? And just walk us through that. What are the actions?
Are you talking to me? I'll keep it short. Being a white ally means more than the statement, more than the photograph. It means being uncomfortable and putting yourself in situations that challenge the structural racism and the interpersonal racism that we see people experience. It means voting. It means hiring people of color and empowering them if you have that sort of agency. It means looking to people of color for leadership. It means listening a lot more than speaking. I think as white people, we have this problem of going into a situation and prescribing the solution for it. And I think what we need to do is we need to listen and act.
Yeah, I think that's huge. And I'll just two quick adds. One, it's just a fascinating time for me where hyper-local seems hugely important and national seems hugely important. And we need to be working on both sides simultaneously. And so whatever we're doing in our own homes, on our block, in our community is so important. And whatever we do to take on this larger issue. The only other maybe just addition I would say to Chris is I'm all on the action part. So no more statements, keep marching, keep doing that. But beyond the march, what are we doing concretely? I would just say that we have to stay with it. And I think these moments come and go. And so if there is less energy 6 months from now than there is today, then this moment would have come and gone and nothing fundamentally changed. Again, if we talk about 400 years in every sector of our society, the economy, housing, healthcare, education, criminal justice, we have to have perseverance. We have to have tenacity. We have to have courage. We got to keep going and to try and erase 400 years, reverse 400 years in the next 4 weeks or the next, 40 months, 4 months or whatever. That's impossible. We're kidding ourselves. So we have to stay with it. As Christian said, we're going to make mistakes. We're going to fall flat in our face. We're going to feel totally inadequate, but we have to keep going together. And if we do that 2, 3, 4 years from now, we would have made some important, although maybe relatively smaller incremental steps in the right direction. If somehow we run out of energy and say, this is too hard, and let's move on to the next thing, in the next 2 months or 3 months or 6 months, then we are again part of the problem, not part of the solution.
I want to just add, there's a question that came through. This was actually submitted ahead of time. I don't know if either of you have a response. I think you might have hit on it, but if there's anything you want to add here. It's from a white gentleman who says, what can you really do? My ancestors did what they did, but we're here now. I'm working on my awareness. I see the Reddit CEO, which is Serena Williams' husband, resign from his job and his position. Are you saying that I don't need to take my promotion? Is it a no-win situation? What am I supposed to do?
No, I don't. Again, I think that's taking it to the extreme. And not everybody has the luxury, or frankly, that I'll say it. It's a privilege to be able to resign your job and still be able to feed your kids and keep a roof over your heads. Not everybody has that privilege, white or black. Most folks don't. But it is, what actions can you do? Can you tutor? Can you teach? Can you hire? Can you become a better patron of Black-owned businesses? Restaurants, yes, but who is your accountant? Who is your lawyer? Who do you invest your money with? We have to build wealth in the minority community here in the country. The wealth disparity is staggering, which drives so many of the inequities, Liz, that we work on around education, healthcare, and other things. And so, no, you don't have to, not quit your job or not take that promotion. I'd say quite the opposite. Take that promotion and do something fantastic with it. So you can leverage that additional power, resources, or whatever to benefit yourself, or you can leverage that additional power and resources to help challenge things and make things a little bit uncomfortable. If you work in basically almost any 99% of companies in America, what does your management team look like? How diverse is that? What does your board of directors look like? Don't just tell me who your janitors are and who your custodians are and who your food service workers and who your gardeners are. Who is the accountant for your firm? Who is the lawyer for your firm? Who does the PR for your firm? Who does the actuarial work for? Who invests? And if we start thinking about that again, not overnight, but over time, that's what has to happen.
I hear you. I would also add that, I'm going to come to you, Christian. I would also add that it's also policy advocacy. It is really getting behind policies when we think about structures and what needs to happen. And that is very important. If you haven't had a chance to check out WBEZ for our audience, if you haven't had a chance to check out what WBEZ recently broadcast around what's happening just in banking, in Chicago here in our backyard, you should really do that. There's some, we don't have time to go into it now, but just like it is very present, it is very real, and is rooted in policy and in structures too. Christian, were you going to add something there?
I was just going to add, and you kind of touched on it, but let's hold our leaders accountable, right? In terms of policies, let's continue to talk about policies that we want to see change, and not be happy with just platitudes or, tiny incremental process. I think we are at the time when we have the momentum, and it's very, very important that we turn that momentum into real positive change.
Okay, we're going to move to Q&A from our audience. We've got about 15 minutes left, and so I want to create time for questions, and there are a lot of them. So I'm going to try to pick out the ones that are most sort of top of mind, or kind of we haven't touched on. So one is around the question of accountability. And this person writes that Jewish people have suffered from the Holocaust, yet they seem to be ahead. Like, where does Black accountability come in?
I think we all have to be accountable. Nobody gets a pass. One thing, Liz, you and I have talked about this is, race and racism is very real, but there are also huge divisions of class in our country. And too often we have, Black middle class or Black bourgeoisie or Black elite, that part of how they measure their social status is the distance they can create between where they are and where folks of color are and how they're struggling. And so all of us have to be in this. None of us, have all the answers. We all have to do more, and accountability for everyone has to be there. But I just want to go back to what I said before. We can't ask Black folk and folks of color to fix 400 years of what we as white people have subtly or not so subtly or institutionally created. And so for us to stand back again and say, okay, you guys, it's on you. That is fundamentally unfair. And frankly, it's impossible. And we as white people, we as white leaders, we as whatever, we have to change our behavior and what we do. We all have to change, but I would say our journey is further and harder and longer than the journey of folks of color. So we can't, none of us can do it by ourselves. We all have to hold ourselves accountable. Nobody gets a pass, but I definitely don't want to put all the onus, or even the majority of the onus, on folks of color. Folks of color have marched, have protested, have preached, have done everything for a long, long time. And here we are. We have to do something different. And again, I think it means all of us has to step up in ways that we haven't been smart enough or courageous enough to do up to this point.
Christian, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to hesitate to give advice on this issue to people of color because it, you know, like Arnie said, this is really our problem to fix. But I would say to people of color who do have agency, I would have the same conversation. You know, make sure we empower more people of color as much as we possibly can. If we have the opportunity to give opportunity, we have to do.
I also want to comment on this. I'll move to the next question. One of my friends who happens to be Jewish chimed in and he said, the Black experience is very different from the Jewish experience 400 years. I think also we should note, and I think this is what we never did in our country, is that when I think about the Holocaust and the atrocities that happened, like if you've ever been to Germany or walked down German streets, I mean, you can barely go 3-4 blocks and there is a plaque or a memorial, and there was intentionality in building the curriculum for young children, like what happened, so it never happens again. And I think about our country and Brian Stevenson's work and what's trying to happen about just acknowledging what happened and giving us a path forward. And we've never really done that as a country as a whole, not to mention the structural racism that we talked about earlier and the policies that exist to keep folks oppressed. So,
one quick thought, Liz, that there's so much again we have to do about reimagining police and better funding schools and access to healthcare and food deserts and all that housing, and the communities you and I work in have been socially distanced for decades. That's a new term, but that's nothing new. But just one other thought I'm thinking about is you think about South Africa, Nelson Mandela, and sort of truth and reconciliation, sessions, and just being able to put stuff on the table, and honestly, to your point, to try and come to grips with the past and address it and try and find some healing and move forward. We've never done anything like that. And whether it's between the police and the community, whether it's white and black, maybe it's between, black gangs, whatever it might be, for us to, wherever these huge tensions, these huge frictions are, is there a way to try to come together and not just keep reliving the past and to try and heal that pain? And if we don't find ways to try and heal that pain, it is hard to move forward. So I just think we have to think about, again, what we've done, some progress, nowhere near enough. We have to try some things, at least think about doing, trying some things that have never been done before, because what we have done, I'm repeating myself, has been utterly inadequate.
Absolutely. Chicago Beyond is actually working on some small pilots of healing, but this is really about a countrywide, statewide, like in our very DNA. This next question is, how has funding for public education created institutionalized racism? How can funding be changed so that public education can be more equitable?
I would put Chris on the spot on this one, but I'll take this one. He can chime in. And but this gets to the core of it, and this is super personal for you and I. That the foundation of public, at least K-12 education in our country, the foundation is based upon local control, and 40 to 50% usually comes from local property taxes. So when I led the Chicago Public Schools, we actually sued the state because our district, that happened to be 85% low income and 90% minority, we received less than half the money each year than our neighbors just 6 or 7 miles north of us along Lake Michigan will receive for their children. You think about that, less than half each year. Think about that for 14 years, pre-K, K, 1 through 12. And so by definition, the kids who need the most after school programs, who need the most social workers, who need the best paid teachers and the best paid principals, and a lot more principals like you, Liz, we had less than half. So those with a silver spoon, those born of privilege, got more than twice as much spent each year. It is fundamentally broken. And for me, the dream of public education, dream of all these things, doesn't matter. It shouldn't matter your race or socioeconomic status or income. If you work hard, you should have a chance to climb that economic ladder and break cycles of poverty, which is sort of the whole point to enter the middle class. But where you have where the system is fundamentally built on inequity, then the system exacerbates the divide between the haves and the have-nots. And just not to go on too long, but I always say, if a great military is our best defense as a country, then I think our best offense would be a great educational system. and one that is not equal, one that is equitable. And I can make a pretty good case that our children in Chicago didn't need the same money as the kids in Winnetka and Wilmette. We actually needed more money because of the challenges in the community and because of the need to feed and other things. And so the system is literally structured to exacerbate oppression and to deny opportunity. And I always say, I'll be really clear on this. That's not a broken system. That's a system designed to do exactly what it is doing. It is designed to be inequitable. And unless we're willing again to take on these harsh truths and brutal truths and change those systems, and there has been some progress in the, whatever it was, 12 or 13 years since we sued the state. I would say we lost that suit, but it was the right fight. And I would do it again tomorrow. And that what's true in Illinois is true almost everywhere in the country. Not everywhere, but almost everywhere. The children of the poor receive less for their education than the children of the wealthy. That's not fair. It's not right. It's not just. It's you could call it educational malpractice, and you can call it morally bankrupt.
Absolutely. I mean, it all goes back to, we talked about the structures, the policies that we all either knowingly or honestly, I mean, we know it, right? Like if the information is out there, we know it, and we subscribe to it, and we let it exist.
We don't fund our we don't fund our military with local property taxpayers. We don't have little militia in our communities. We fund it as a national priority. We fund it at the national level. That's what a country that's really serious about their educational system, that's what they do.
Yeah, it's all by design. This question came through, how do we as white people balance embracing white silence with deliberately being quiet so we can listen? As a white woman, no one needs to hear from me right now, but I do need to be quiet and listen to the experience of my Black neighbors around me. Is that white silence?
No, I mean, I think we need to listen, but I think we need to take the knowledge that we learn by listening and share that with the people closest to us. This is an opportunity to learn, and it's an opportunity to share that learning with the people that we love. So I think that there's a balance there. We have to learn when to listen, and we have to learn when to be able to share what we've listened to. And I think the opportunity to share that exists at work. It exists in our family, with our children, with our students, with our neighbors, and our friends. And there is a lot of opportunity to not be silent, especially when we're seeing racism in action. I think it's very, very important that if we see it in action, whether it's a joke or, a violent act or the way somebody's being treated or anything, we need to speak up. That is not the time to be silent. The time, I think, right now to be silent is when we are learning what we've maybe for generations have kind of avoided learning.
I'm going to pop to this next one. What would true equality look like for white people? What would we have to give up as white people? As an example, I've been given, I'm trying to read this. Sorry, it doesn't make a lot. I've been something around connected to property taxes, which, sorry, we'll have to come back to that one. Guys, if you could see that when I see you in the document, if you could just fix what that question is, I'm trying to understand what that is. Let's see here for Christian, when you talk about doing the work to repair the damage you cause, what type of work do you mean? How does this play into the idea of reparations?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it started off with self-reflection. It started off with understanding myself before I even went out and understood the damage that I'd caused in the world. And then it meant, and this happened to me inadvertently. I didn't even start on this path. It happened to me when I met somebody who I had hurt in my past and challenged me on that. Even though I had disengaged from the movement, had denounced it, I still hadn't done the work at that point. About 5 years after I had left, to really understand what I had done. And it was somebody I had hurt in my past who really said, it's not just enough to say you're sorry. You have to actually go out and fix the damage you've caused. And part of that was listening, going to the people I had hurt, the communities that I had hurt, and not only saying I'm sorry, but understanding what I could do to make the situation better, if I could. And then for the last 25 years, it's been sharing what I've been learning along the way with people who are engaged in these hate movements to help them disengage, to offer them a new perspective, to challenge them. And, you know, in terms of, you know, reparations, if we look back at the 400 or 500 years of inequity that has faced the community of color, and we look back at how they haven't been able to accumulate wealth, how they haven't had access to the same opportunities in terms of housing, how they've been held back by the criminal justice system. And to think that we can just say now, okay, racism is over, we're going to fix the laws, and everybody can just kind of go off on their own without saying, we've had a head start for 400 years, and we need to find a way to make that, you know, equitable again. So I do support reparations. I do think that we need to not only fix the laws that are broken and the structural racism, but we need to find a way to level the playing field. It's not just about equality, it's about equity. It's about making sure that we all can play on the same field going forward.
I want you guys to each, this is going to be hard, but if you give me your 30-second answer on this, or just talk to me in bullets on this question. This is the one I was trying to get to earlier. Thank you, Chicago Beyond, for fixing it. What would true equality look like for white people? What would we have to give up? An example is if education funding was not connected to property taxes, it would change the way things look in a lot of our neighborhoods. What other tangible examples are there, and how can white allies truly understand what it means and prepare themselves so the work doesn't stall when it gets very personal? I feel like being on the right side is relatively easy for us right now, but once we faced our own privilege and haven't been asked to make any sacrifices as of yet.
I'll just say we have to give up power, and that being on the right side is hard. It's not easy. If it's easy enough work, then we should do more.
These are really hard questions. Those are really important ones, complex. Let me say a couple of things. I agree with Christian, there is a giving up of some things, including power, but this stuff is not all a zero-sum game. If we increase funding for education across the country, I guess maybe we're giving up a few more dollars of taxes, but that benefits all of us. And it's not like my kid doesn't get less than someone else's kid. It's just, we're trying to just level that playing field. If we treated the crack epidemic in the 90s as a healthcare crisis rather than a criminal crisis, I would argue that would have saved us lots of money, because prisons are a hell of a lot more expensive than healthcare is, and giving people help. So there's some economic returns there. I mean, one of the places where hard left and hard right come together is around criminal justice reform, because the cost of incarceration, our young men to get locked up in Cook County jail is about $60,000 a year. Nobody benefits from that. There's got to be better ways to do that. If there was more access to capital from banks to buy a home or to get a loan to start a business, that's not taking anything out of my pocket. So yes, there are places where we may have to sacrifice something and have to be willing to have that hard conversation. But in many of these things, I would argue from an economic standpoint, it may actually save us money. It would make us safer. It would broaden out these communities in ways that haven't happened. There was more access to healthcare. If there are less food deserts, that's not hurting us. So should we be prepared to sacrifice? Yes. But this is not, I don't want anyone to think this is all a zero-sum game, or that it's one size pie. This pie could grow for lots of folks and be much more equitable and just and fair. And again, there are examples all over the world where other folks do this in a more thoughtful manner than us. Not to go, one more, the issue around guns and gun violence, that wildly disproportionately impacts the communities where you and I work, Liz. If we had some gun laws where we actually cared more about saving lives and keeping kids safe and reducing fear and trauma rather than the gun lobby, that doesn't cost us anything. In fact, would save us. Every homicide here in Chicago every year every single one costs about $1.3 million. I'd sure love to spend that money in a very, very different way. So I don't want everyone to think every issue is going to pit white versus black or whatever. We need to come at this in a very, very different way.
This is the start of a series for Chicago Beyond. If you are just joining us for the first time at one of our events, we encourage you to subscribe to the newsletter. We're going to be having an ongoing series of events, really unpacking all of what's happening around us and really giving people tools. So I encourage folks who are listening in to subscribe to the newsletter. I just want to end on this note. A couple quick things. One, if you haven't checked out that WBEZ art or story, please check that out on what's happening with banks. Two, we have a list of resources we're going to send out to everyone who is here today of like what to do, next steps, what to be reading, thinking about, and actually doing. So be on the lookout for that in your email. And I'll end with a quote from this book. Again, if you have not seen this book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, you should really pick it up. Kindy says, the good news is that racists and anti-racists are not fixed identities. We can be racist one minute and an anti-racist the next. What we say about race, what we do about race in each moment determines what, not who we are. We know as a society how to be racist. We know how to pretend to be not racist. Now, let's know how to be anti-racist. So thank you, Christian, for joining us, Arnie, for joining us today. We're glad to be with you. Thank you for each of you who joined, for all your questions. And we look forward to our next time together in the next 2 weeks. So talk to you soon. Take care, everybody. Bye.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.